At the Royal Institution, we believe that science shapes our lives, our culture, and the world around us. That's why we create opportunities for everyone to discover, discuss, and critically examine science. Through our innovative public events, world-famous Christmas lectures, and cutting-edge education programmes. In fact, we've been doing this for well over 200 years now. Help us inspire everyone to think more deeply about the place of science in our lives.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Royal Institution. Hands up if you've been here before. Welcome back. And hands up if it's your first time here. Welcome. You'll enjoy tonight and hopefully you'll come back for more events in the future because we do a lot of them. If I could put the holding slide up because... I'm Lisa. I work on the public programme here. I'm just going to do a few health and safety things. If there is a fire alarm, unfortunately, it is real. So if you have a look around, there are fire exits everywhere. Just make your way out of those. And our staff members will help you go to our meeting point outside and then bring you all back in when it turns out everything is fine. Obviously not in these ones because there are cameras and they're probably very expensive. And if you could turn your phones onto silent, that would really help because we don't want to distract the speakers. Feel free to take some pictures every now and again. If you want to take some notes or anything like that, turn the flash off because, again, don't want to distract the awesome talk happening here. Yeah, that's it from me. I'm going to now hand over to the Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Biology, Mark Downs.
Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to welcome everyone here again. Almost everything we do in partnership. And it's fantastic to be here in partnership working with the Royal Institution today and also with the Biochemical Society. Biochemical Society is a large learning society, has 7,000 members, specialises in the molecular sciences in all forms, does publishing. If you'd like to know more about what they do, there's some staff here tonight, I'm sure they'd be delighted to speak to you, or do go and look at the Biochemical Society's website. The Royal Society of Biology is a charity. And we have a membership of all sorts. And I'm not going to talk about what we do because you can go and look at the website and we want to get on with the evening. But do have a look at our website. All I really wanted to say is that as a membership organisation, we have lots of professional biologists, but equally we have lots of people who are interested in the biosciences. So whether it's immunology or physiology or forestry or agriculture, microbiology, whatever it happens to be, if you have an interest in that, then come to us because we are a very broad church and we'll be delighted to see you and welcome you to events like this. This is our 8th Biology Week, and we've got events all around the country through our regional branches, and in fact beyond the UK. Last night we had a debate on insect decline. Tomorrow night we've got a parliamentary reception at Westminster. We have an award ceremony at the Crick on Thursday, and events, as I said, in all 4 of the home nations as well. So have a look at the website, and if you want to come along to something else, there's lots of things that hopefully you can get involved with. But it's also a very special year for us generally because 10 years ago, well not today, but this month, the Royal Society of Biology was formed in its current state from a merger of 2 pre-existing organisations. So from this Biology Week this year to Biology Week next year, we're going to have a whole celebration of anniversary events. There's a microsite, go and have a look at all the things we're doing, and do try and get involved. It's also 70 years since the foundation of the original institute, 40 years since we got our Royal Charter, so lots of things to celebrate. And lots of events like this involve public engagement, so again, do look at the website and try to get involved. So you'll see that there are some hashtags. Do tweet during the course of the evening. I really hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will. All these events have always been fantastic. And it's a great pleasure to hand over to the panel for this evening to talk you through what we're going to be doing, Gaia Vince and her colleagues. So thank you very much.
Hello. We
talked about this loads before we even came in, and now we've messed up already.
You're here. Brilliant. Hello, and welcome. It's a huge pleasure to see you all here today to discuss something which I think we all really care about. And we particularly care about it, strangely, just of the last year or so, because of media interest, because a David Attenborough program, for example. But it's been a problem for a while, plastics in our oceans. So my name is Gaia Vince. I'm a writer and a science journalist, and I've traveled the world looking at environmental problems, and everywhere I've been, I've seen plastics in the oceans. And in some places I've been, they've actually been really usefully deployed. I've seen entire islands made out of plastic garbage tied together so that people can live and build their houses and have their animals on these islands. But of course, there are also, I believe, maybe a few downsides, but we will discuss that. But first of all, plastics, it's an incredible invention, isn't it? It's flexible, it's cheap, it's light, it's thermally and chemically and electrically pretty inert. So you can use it to wrap wires, electrical wires. You can use it for a saucepan handle. It's pretty much changed our world. It can be transparent, it can be opaque, you can have it in every color. Plastic is fantastic, as I think the song goes. So we love plastic. One of the reasons it's so useful is because it doesn't biodegrade very easily, if at all. So that means it's ideal for packaging food and water and making it go farther. And it also means it's incredibly useful in hospitals and for medical care. So plastic's really useful. We listen to our music, we wear it. We can't imagine the modern world without plastic. So we produce 300,000 tons of plastic each year, just 20% of which is incinerated or recycled. The rest ends up in our ecosystems, and a lot of that gets washed into our waterways and ultimately into the oceans. And at a macro scale, it's a nuisance and also it can be a hazard. So for marine wildlife, turtles end up thinking a plastic bag is a jellyfish. At the micro level, it's getting absorbed into all layers of our ecosystem. And finding its way into the food chain. And we're still just starting to understand what that might do to us at the top of the food chain. Because of the ocean's circulatory system, it ends up everywhere. We get it from the Arctic to the Amazon. And when we eat our seafood, we're also eating our plastic waste. So if you think of our human world, if you think of our actions ourselves, what we throw away is now getting consumed by us. We've shrunk the planet down to within our own operating sphere. And that's quite a profound realization. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're all driven to worry about this and to think, what can we do personally to change this? So, it is illegal. It's been illegal since 1988 to put plastic in the oceans, but I think it's still happening. So this summer, leaders of the G20 developed the Osaka Blue Ocean Vision with the aim to reduce additional marine plastic pollution to zero by 2050. How are we going to do that? Well, tonight, very excitingly, we have a range of experts. Among them, we have marine biologists, ecologists, material scientists who are going to help discuss and try and find a solution to this. We're going to save the marine environment tonight. And with your help and your involvement, your questions and your engagement, we are going to do it. So I'm just going to tell you the names of the people here. They're going to introduce themselves. We have Ted Henry. We have Anna Poshaisky. We have Penny Lindeque, and we have David Jones. Please welcome them.
Okay, good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk to you about this topic. So I am at Heriot-Watt University, and I'm a professor of environmental toxicology. And I will say it's also very exciting for me to see the amount of interest that the topic of plastics has gotten. And as a toxicologist, I've worked on numerous different types of substances, and plastics are the least toxic substance that I've worked on, yet it has gotten the most interest compared to all of them. I entered the topic of plastics and the effects of plastics on organisms from particle toxicology. I was working on engineered nanomaterials, and so some of the same technical approaches to investigating the toxicology of those particles were very useful for investigating plastic particles, both in the micron size and also in the nano size. But how do I advance here? Other direction. Okay, well, let's see. I'll get this going here. There we go. That's me. So now, one of the things that I realized, after initially starting looking at environmental effects in organisms and specific hypotheses in that context, was that the topic of plastics was very large, multifaceted, and the addressing this larger topic became of greater interest to me. And one of the things that we've done at Heriot-Watt University is to form this consortium to address the topic of plastics from multiple sectors. And that's what COMPASS is, and it's to lead this multidisciplinary research to address some of the challenges that we're facing. And so this is one of the types of things that we're interested in engaging in. The topic areas that we, the Heriot-Watt has a large international presence with campuses in Malaysia and Dubai, in addition to in the UK, and so we have a very global focus, which is what's needed in the plastics area, and also expertise in multiple areas that are well outside of the topics that I work in. Over the last several years, maybe 5 or 10 years actually, I've had funding from the Natural Environment Research Council in the UK and some European funding bodies to look at the effects of plastics in organisms. And I'm just going to show a couple quick slides of some of the things that we've looked at. So one of the postdocs on the project developed a way to label polystyrene nanoparticles. So one of the challenges that we have with plastics is to identify them in tissues and see where they are effectively. They behave much different than other types of substances. So she designed, her name is Dr. Maya Al-Sid-Sheikh, she designed polystyrene nanoplastics with a C14 label, which allowed us to track them. And this slide here shows that in a scallop, the plastic particles accumulated very swiftly. But most of them are on the external surfaces of the tissue. There's only a very subtle indication of the absorption of those into the tissues, and I'll be glad to talk about that more in the question part. One of the topics that's of particular interest is whether when we or other organisms ingest plastic particles, are they truly absorbed across epithelial membranes to accumulate in internal organs, for example, the liver or other tissues. If they are not getting absorbed, then the danger of them having a presence in those other tissues is quite low. This is some work we did in my lab looking at the absorption of plastic particles in a zebrafish larvae. This is one of the model organisms that we use, and you can see that these fluorescent labeled plastic particles are accumulating only in the digestive tract of these organisms, and we're not seeing it in the other organisms. We know that toxic substances can associate with plastic. So in the environment, if you pick up a piece of plastic, there'll be many other substances that are associated with it. So you might wonder, well, if an organism ingests that piece of plastic, will those substances that are attached to the plastic be bioavailable in organisms? Depends on the situation. In many cases, they are not very bioavailable. Okay, one of the things that is also a concern that we've worked on quite a bit is the topic of humans ingesting seafood that might have plastics within that, and what is the risk for humans in that case. So one of my postdocs, Dr. Anna Caterino, was investigating the amount of microplastics that were found in mussels collected around the coast of Scotland. And so she digested the tissue off of the mussel and then counted how many microplastic fibers were there. And I was getting calls from various journalists asking me, okay, so what is the risk to human, from ingesting mussels? And I was always reluctant to make a comment about that because the study wasn't about that. But what we did was to say, okay, let's put your results in context. And so what we did was to sample the area where around the dinner table, essentially, and ask the question, are you getting more plastic exposure just from eating within your house? The plastic particles that are falling on your plate from the air, these fibers and dust fibers. What we find is that there's far more plastic particles that the human exposure is getting from that type of exposure than the mussels. So if you're worried about plastic ingestion, it's not really going to be from the seafood in that context. Okay. That's for me, and I was told to do 5 minutes. I think I've kept it to that, and I will pass it over to Anna now.
Thank you. I haven't got any slides. Hi, everyone. I'm the material scientist on the panel, so it's my job here tonight to sort of say that plastics are great, and they are. And actually, Guy's done a brilliant job of just describing how fantastic they are. And they're fantastic because of their materials properties. And so as a material scientist, I'm really interested in why are plastics so strong? Why are they so lightweight? Why can we make them any color or no color at all? And what's the molecular mechanisms that we can do that with? Now, it's these materials properties that have caused the problems that we're here to speak about tonight. The fact that plastics are so lightweight means that they float in the ocean. But I would argue that actually this problem of plastic waste is part of a bigger societal problem of just the fact that we throw everything away. So yes, plastics float in the sea, they get into wildlife, that's very upsetting. We also throw away all of our metals, all of our ceramics, all of our glasses, all of the materials that we use, we throw away. But because they sink, or because they don't get in the ocean in the first place, we don't see them. And it's the shock of seeing those plastics in the ocean that I think has mobilized so many of us to really care about this problem. So I thought I'd give a little introduction, just in this first 5 minutes, to the alternatives to plastic that get bandied around. Now, I think, well, it's material scientists like me, it's our whole job, right, to choose the best material for any particular application. So wherever you see plastics in your lives, they've been chosen by material scientists because it's the best material for the job. Now, if that means wrapping up apples in a plastic packaging in the supermarket, that's there for a reason, and it's there to reduce food waste. It's there to keep it, fresh and clean. And people spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, and so a lot of the reactionary changes that have been suggested, I think, in finding alternatives to plastics haven't been completely thought through, in my opinion. So let's take a little look at some of those alternatives. Now, the first of these that I've got on my list is biodegradable plastics. Now, what I think people mean by that when they say biodegradable is a plastic that they can put into their garden or that ends up in the sea that will be broken down by environmental processes like bacteria or fungi or chemical processes in the environment, and then that plastic will magically disappear. And then that's the end of it, right? That's not quite how it works, because when plastics, or when any material biodegrades, it gets changed chemically into other chemicals. Now, in the case of many plastics, what happens is that those long chain molecules that make up those polymers get snipped up by all the enzymes in the bellies of the bacteria or the fungi or whatever's doing the biodegrading. And when those molecules get snipped up, they don't disappear, they just become shorter chains of plastic molecules. And in material science, when we see shorter chains of plastic molecules, usually what that tells us is that the melting point of that plastic is going to be reduced. Now, the upshot of that is that these solid materials, these solid plastics, become liquid plastics. And that becomes a different issue in our environment. Do we want floating plastic bags that are solid, or do we want floating microplastics that we can't see, that are liquids? And there's other brilliant experts on this panel that are going to be talking about microplastics as well. Just briefly then, other alternatives, paper, right? Doesn't ever behave as well as plastic in pretty much all of the applications that I've ever seen. Paper bags, for example, pretty pants actually are doing the job of holding chopping. And they come with different problems. So a paper bag, stick it in your garden, it biodegrades, fine, but that also gives off CO2. Now, if we multiply that by all of our plastic bags, change them all to paper, all of that CO2 is a significant thing that we need to be thinking about, right? So we can't get anything for free, is what I'm saying. The other day, I got offered an aluminium can of still water, and that made me very cross. And what made me cross about that was that aluminium is super expensive. It's expensive because we have to use a lot of electricity to extract it from aluminium ore. Most aluminium actually is recycled now, so that's quite a good thing. It's very easy to recycle, but it's not as easy as plastic because the melting point of aluminium is around 600 degrees. Melting points of most plastics are around 200 or 300. So that's automatically twice as much energy that you need to melt that thing and turn it into another object to recycle it. So, like I say, there's nothing for free that we get with this problem. The final alternative is nothing. I alluded earlier to supermarket packaging. Well, if you don't package all your fruits and vegetables in anything, what you end up with is probably having to produce 10 times as much of that stuff, because 10 times as much of it is going to end up getting bashed or bruised and isn't sellable. And so we end up with this problem of food waste. Now, food waste, as many of you will know, generates a lot of methane and carbon dioxide as it degrades. And that's obviously a different environmental problem, but one which needs to be taken into account. So the point that I'm making is that this is such a complex issue and that all of our alternatives have bonuses and negatives. And so when we are trying to encourage our supermarkets or the people that are making our products to consider different packagings, all of those different materials conundrums really need to be considered as well. So finally, what do we need to do? Well, I think that we need to rethink our whole materials economy. Now, what I mean by a materials economy, currently our materials economy is quite linear. So we produce our materials, we do something quite useful with them, and then we put them into landfill or they end up in the oceans. Now, what we would prefer to do is to see that become circular, a circular materials economy, so that we produce these materials, that we keep them in usage. So we either recycle them a lot, or once they can't be recycled anymore, we are able to refurbish our goods, we're able to repair things. Now, we as consumers need to start saying, it's not good enough that my iPhone only lasts 2 years. It's not good enough that my washing machine will only last 5 years. We need to start really pressing for value of materials, and that includes value of plastics. And that's, I think, the economic reason why we see so much plastic in the ocean is that we don't value plastic as the amazing material that it is. And we'll be discussing more of that tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks, that was great. Thank you very much, Anna. So I'm Penny Lindeque, and I'm from Plymouth Marine Laboratory. First of all, I wholeheartedly agree with what Anna has said. I think plastics are really useful to society. Unfortunately, I think society are slow to adequately deal with those plastics at their end of life. If you walk onto any beach around the world, you're likely to see plastic litter, washed up at the back of the beach, entangled in that strand line. And I think many people are aware of the problem that plastic litter can cause to charismatic marine animals, be it a seal entangled in ghost fishing gear or a bird with a stomach full of plastic items. But something which we have touched upon, and as a scientist, I'm equally concerned with the really small microscopic sized plastic that we don't readily see. This is termed microplastic, and it's defined by being less than 5 millimeters in size. It comes from a number of different sources in a huge array of colors, shapes, sizes, and polymers. So some microplastics are manufactured to be small in size, such as cosmetics, such as the microbeads in cosmetic products. Some of them are derived from the fragmentation of larger plastic items. We also get fibers shed from clothing when they're washed. And with the wear and tear of tires and paint on the road, a lot of these microplastics end up in our marine environment. So as a marine ecologist, I first heard about the prevalence of these microplastics in the marine environment over 10 years ago. So I was keen to know, well, they're very small. Are they actually a problem to the small marine animals at the base of the food chain? And these animals are called zooplankton, and they might be very small, but they're highly, highly abundant and very important. So they graze on the phytoplankton, the primary producers, and they pass this energy up through the food web to higher trophic levels, including commercially important fish and whales. So our first investigations were just to say, if we expose these different species of zooplankton to fluorescently labeled microplastics, do they have the capacity to ingest them? And yes, they do. Every species we looked at had the capacity to ingest microplastics. Here we've got Here we've got a copepod, which is a very dominant and permanent member of the zooplankton community, whereas these two we call mirror plankton. So they only spend their larval stage in the plankton. And this is a bivalve larvae and a decapod larvae, which when they grow up become the benthic organisms on our seabed. This is a video which I'm not sure I can get working from here. No, unfortunately. So it has cilia at the opening, and it wafts its little cilia around.
Working.
Oh, thank you very much. It wafts its cilia to create a feeding current. And as you can see, it's dragging the microplastics into its esophagus and down into the gut. So we know that in the lab, the zooplankton can ingest the microplastics, but we've also gone out into the field to see, do the zooplankton in their natural environment ingest microplastics at the concentration that they're there in our sea? And yes, they do. This is a picture of a wild-caught thickback sole larvae, and here is a tiny fibre that's found in its stomach. We then went back to the lab and say, okay, so if the zooplankton are ingesting microplastics, is that having a negative impact on their health? Yes, it is. If the zooplankton are ingesting microplastics, they don't eat as much. Therefore, they have a decline in their energy reserves, and they have a lower reproductive output. So if microplastic exposure has an impact on endpoints, such as reproduction and growth and survival, then this is of direct relevance to animal populations and communities. But it's not just the zooplankton. We've looked at animals right the way throughout the marine food web. And everyone that we've looked at, every species or group that we've looked at, has ingested microplastics in the natural environment. So from zooplankton, shellfish, as Ted was talking about earlier, fish, seabirds, turtles, and marine mammals. Fortunately, one of my PhD students had the lovely task of getting all the strandings of marine mammals from around the UK and going through their guts to find microplastics, which in every single one, from seals and dolphins and whales, we found plastic. So these microplastics are ingested directly. They're also taken in via the gills, and they're ingested indirectly. So when they eat prey which is contaminated with microplastic, such as trophic transfer. So there's still a lot we really don't know. We're not absolutely sure where all those microplastics are coming from, how they're being transported, where they're accumulating, what impact they're having on the marine animals, and actually what impact are the marine animals having on the transformation and movement of those microplastics. But if we look at the precautionary principle, we know enough to understand that we really want to stop the flow of plastics into our ocean. Even if we stopped dumping plastics in the seas tomorrow, with what's there and the fragmentation rate, we would still get more and more microplastics. So that's why our recent research has actually moved across to looking at solutions, and in particular biological solutions. And one of the things we've just started with funding from Waitrose is looking at a feasibility study to see whether we can use mussels to remove microplastics from the water. So mussels and other bivalves are naturally really good at filtering the water. And 1 meter square patch of mussels can filter 150,000 litres of seawater a day. So we're looking at whether these mussel reefs could be strategically placed to help protect more sensitive areas, aquaculture, or just the stem of microplastics from outflows into the sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is David Jones, and I'm the CEO and founder of a conservation organisation. It's a marine conservation organisation called Just One Ocean. In 2008, I was very fortunate to be in a bar in Bristol, having just spent 2 years in the Bahamas filming for a BBC series called Life. Somebody's got to do it. And it was the launch of the film, of the series, and all the Natural History Unit people used to go there and have a few drinks, and hope that Sir David would grace us with his presence, but he didn't. But I met one of the producers who was not on my program, but was on another part of the series. And she said, "Have you heard about this island of plastic in the Pacific?" I said, "No." "Tell me more." And she said, "Well, apparently there's this island of plastic." So I started looking into it. And she said, "Well, I'm going out to go and have a look." "Okay, off you go, come back and tell me what it's like." So she came back and said, "It's terrible." I said, "How big's the island?" She said, "No, there is no island." I said, "Well, why is that terrible?" She said, "It's a lot worse. It's a lot worse than that. We can't actually see it. It's everywhere. It's just concentrated. This is something we need to do." So I then ended up joining the Plastic Oceans Foundation in about 2009, which was the first time we filmed David Attenborough actually talking about plastic, way before Blue Planet 2. And we spent 7 years making a film to educate people, to tell people. When I did talks in 2009, there were probably half a dozen people in the audience, so I'm glad to see things are coming along. Thank you. But that was the problem. Nobody really knew, nobody really cared, and things are starting to happen. We've got a lot of experts here, and I hope that some of the questions that come out are there, but certain things to think about. At this moment in time, just think about what, for example, this government or many other governments are actually doing to combat this particular issue. There is a groundswell, there's a lot of stuff going on at grassroots level. But what have they done? Well, in England, the government banned plastic bags, or didn't ban plastic bags, they put a levy on plastic bags. Those devolved governments in Scotland and Wales did it way before we did. However, we finally got there. The only problem was that we put a caveat that it only applied to organisations of 250 employees. What a cop-out. What else have they done? They banned biobeads. Well, that was going to happen anyway because there was enough of a groundswell of information out there that was saying, we don't want this. We don't want this. So it was an easy, quick vote-winning or not vote-losing opportunity, if I could be slightly cynical. But apart from that, there hasn't really been anything. Everything is a knee-jerk reaction to certain things. You know, we're looking at banning straws and banning stirrers and the odd cotton bud stick. That's great, but it's not going to be enough. And what we actually need is a strategic plan that looks at science, invests in science, that looks at education so that people do know, that encourages and supports innovation, that provides alternatives, because if you take something away from somebody, they want something else in its place. That also includes public participation, public engagement, because we have to bring people along, and finally has legislation to back it up. So the debate or the discussion is it too late to save our oceans? Well, I'm an optimist. Plastic is still a problem rather than being a predicament like climate change. And if it is, we're screwed. So hopefully we can get some good questions and find some answers this evening. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, some really interesting thoughts there. And we're going to have a little discussion so that we can hear a little bit more from everybody, a bit more of a discussion about how we might handle this really, really complicated problem. Because I think one thing that everybody's brought out is that this isn't some sort of binary issue. It's not, oh, let's just ban plastics and we're all fine, or you know, we'll just sweep up the plastics. It's a very complicated thing, and one of the issues is, of course, plastics' longevity in the ocean systems, which we've already touched on. So we're going to have a little discussion, and then I'm going to open it out to questions from you. So have a little think if anything strikes you during the discussion that you'd like to bring up. But first of all, one thing that surprised me is something that David talked about. Really, is that he was involved in television programs about the oceans 10 years ago. Everybody here has been working in this field for a long time, and it feels like there's suddenly been a sea change in the last year or so. I mean, is this a good thing? What triggered it? Why? Well,
I mean, so I think that the attention that the plastic issue has generated around environmental awareness is very good, as long as it's appropriately directed, and that the plastics topic. We also have to recognize that some of the information that we're exposed to is speculation and it's overstatement, and we're very vulnerable to going down a path that actually could lead to greater environmental damage in another sector. So, for example, imagine if we were to get rid of large sectors of plastics, the replacement to that could have considerably greater environmental impact in terms of release of greenhouse gases and subsequent climate change. So we have to be very careful about how we engage in that. I think that the attention that the topic has brought to environmental science is very good, as long as it's based on sound science rather than the speculation and overstatement that sometimes I see.
Yeah, this is something that Anna particularly mentioned. So, I mean, there are two schools of thought here. One of them is, isn't it great that so many people are engaged? We have Extinction Rebellion people cutting off half of London at the moment. We have people calling for incredible, reducing to zero carbon by whatever in 5 years or something. And we have a lot of people saying, let's just ban plastics. I mean, one school of thought is, well, just getting people worked up and excited and involved in actually doing something about our environmental challenges the main thing. And if the details are a little bit, iffy, it doesn't really matter. Whereas other people are of the thoughts, well, it actually really does matter, and we need to get this right now. It's nuanced. Is the public ready to understand the nuance, Anna?
It's really interesting. I think, yes, we have an opportunity with this galvanization of the public around this issue of plastics to put pressure, if we put it on the right people, to make a really effective change. But like we've hinted at all evening so far, it's such a complex problem. And so it's our responsibility as people who are, paid to be experts, actually, to look into this stuff. It's our responsibility to communicate that responsibly. And it's been really funny in the field of material science, because suddenly there's a war on plastics, and there's never been a war on metals or a war on wood, and so the public kind of attack on a material this is the first time it's ever happened, and I think they're attacking the wrong people, because who we should be attacking is ourselves, because it's not the plastics problem. The plastic's great. It's us that's using it irresponsibly.
Does anybody else want to talk about that? Yes, David.
I think there's a couple of issues here. The first one is a problem which scientists have, and we're all scientists, and I class myself, although not quite as esteemed as yourselves, as a scientist, because scientists write papers that are read by scientists. And, I was talking to the rest of the team backstage about my son, and he wrote a paper the other day which went into Journal of Infectious Diseases. He works at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, and I read this thing, and I didn't understand a word of it. And I said, what is it? He said, well, it basically says that the drugs that we used to use for malaria, actually, which we didn't think were any good, are okay. I said, well, why don't you just say that then? And I think this is a fundamental problem. And I think the other thing is, you're talking about, are the people ready for it? And I think to some extent they are. We have to bring the people along. I spoke last week at the Plastic Health Summit in Amsterdam about the importance and the role of public engagement, because it can help with science. It helps with my own citizen science projects. It can help persuade government. Although science should drive government policy, it sometimes needs a little bit of a kick. And so you need it for that as well. And I think, we have to bring them along and we have to trust them. Sometimes it's difficult, and the World Health Organization paper that came out the other day, which the media totally misconstrued and said, plastic in your water doesn't cause you harm, which is not what it said. It actually said, we don't know what harm it caused, but it was very carefully twisted. And I understand why, because can you imagine a paper coming out that says, don't drink plastic, it's going to kill you. Don't drink water, it's going to kill you. I mean, it would just go mad. And I think, so we have to be cautious. We do need to bring people along, and we need to speak more plainly. That's it.
I mean, one of the problems is, of course, that in order to find out what harm it does and what happens as plastic disintegrates in its various stages, and we're talking about an enormous ecosystem of different terrain, from beaches to deltas to deep sea to deep high seas to shallow oceans. So many different areas. It takes time. I mean, Penny, you're working with Zooplankton. It takes time to see how many microbeads does it ingest? What is the, how do you extrapolate that as to a big community? What would the, can we speed this up? Should we announce that it's dangerous or it's not dangerous before we've even done these researches, when we need to have action now? But what are we basing it on?
I don't think we can speed it up, and I think that's one of the problems, that this has been such an emotive topic that in some ways it's running before we can walk. And it's great, there's a lot of grassroots optimism, and likewise I think we're in time to save the ocean, but some of that is based on what comes out in the media, which just isn't correct. And unfortunately the science does take a little while. And if we're not careful, some of the alternatives, some of the biodegradable products are going to be equally as bad, if not worse. So it's really good that the public are coming along with us, but we do need to try not to run before we can walk. Because as you said, quite often there's knee-jerk reactions, banning one stirrer, banning... I don't know, perhaps I can ask, who thinks here that microbeads in cosmetics have now been banned? You put your hand up if you believe it's been banned. Do you know what, so did I, actually. When you look into the policy, it's only banned in those products which are washed off directly. So things like shower gel. But loads of creams, loads of moisturizers are absolutely full of microbeads still. Do a nice job of packing up all the wrinkles, because that's not deemed to be washed off until you shower the next day or in the evening. So I think it is really difficult to get the message out there, and I think the media are very quick to say, we've solved it, we've banned this, we've done this. It needs a much more strategic approach to how we're going to use plastic properly.
I mean, one of the problems, I think, with environmental issues is that it does take time. So plastics have only been around for a century, for God's sake, and they've only been a problem for less than that because they weren't so widely used. But if we look at other environmental problems, if we look at, for example, climate change, it's taken decades and decades of science, of models, of proof that this is an actual problem before people start acting. And so perhaps people can understand that while this is a problem now, we should act now and not wait 50 years down the line.
I think you're absolutely right. And we have, certainly in this country and and within the European Union, what I call consultation overload. We are... And consultation is good, and I understand that's all part of the public engagement process, and it generally ends up with the right decision, but it does two key things. One, it increases the cost, and two, it increases the time it takes. Now, generally, when there's an emergency like a state of war, governments take actions because they understand the severity of what's going on. And I think, probably the wrong thing to say, I don't know, people will disagree. There's almost an emergency here that the government needs to just take some action and at an international level, and say, we have to do this, And it's interesting that some of the other countries out there, so I think Belize, for example, they just went, do you know what, this is really destroying the second largest coral reef in the world. so we'll ban it. By the way, that's happening in April 2019. They said that in December 2018. You know,
so it can happen really quickly. It can be turned around. So let's look now at how we can solve this problem of plastics in the ocean. And we've heard already from all of our experts of various approaches. So either starting right at the manufacturing level with this idea that when we design a product, when we design and choose the materials we use for that product, we need to think, first of all, not just about, we need to think holistically. We need to not just have the designer thinking what makes it look pretty, the engineer saying what makes it more useful, and then the manufacturer saying, you know, how much would it cost to sell it. We need to build into the design and the engineering of the product the end of life of that and make sure it recirculates. Now, the problem with plastic is that unlike a lot of metals, it loses a lot of its value the more it's recycled. So how are we going to get around that, Anna?
Oh, that's a big question. I think...
And also, I will say that with, if we're talking about an aluminium can, which, yes, you know, if you're getting aluminium out of bauxite and all that is really expensive, but it is one material, whereas most of our products... You know, let's look at this iPhone. It's got a bit of plastic here. It's got some rare earth metals. It's got it's made of multiple materials all glued together, different elements. It's really, really hard to take apart and get any value out of that. What are we going to do?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so you've touched on a real problem with recycling of plastics, which is that they get tied up and mixed together and sort of attached to all sorts of other materials. And most of us, if it's our responsibility to put them in the recycling bin, we often don't even take the plastic window out of the paper thing on the sandwich thing, right? Like, people, I think, that's a really easy example of something that we just don't do, even though it'd be easy, let alone an iPhone, which contains like over half the periodic table in it. Right? And they're also designed that you can't even like take the battery out anymore. Yeah. Like, how are we supposed to be recycling those materials? It's impossible, and it's designed that way. And it's designed that way so that, in this example, mobile phone companies can sell more phones, in my opinion. That's how they've designed them. And now we need to, as consumers, as I said earlier, to really take a stand on that and say, well, no, if my phone battery's broken, why can't I just replace the battery? If my camera's not as good, why can't I just upgrade to the newest camera? Now, there are companies that are putting together these kinds of modular products, but it's slow and it's not cool. And do you know what I mean? Like, there's so many societal things that we need to change about the idea of fixing stuff and making.
And ultimately, it comes from regulation. So this built-in obsolescence, which I think we've been talking about a little bit. So the European Union is now enacting new legislation to try and make companies responsible for their products once they've left the consumer. And there's already been the weed. I'm not going to bore on about these legislative changes, but they're very slow, and we as consumers, instead of saying ban this, ban that, perhaps should be looking and arguing that we want longer life for our products, and that actually what we value is not the fashion of a changing look or a changing trend in shape, but actually the longevity of a product. So we already have that with some of our products like antiques and so on. We value them because of their age and their lastingness, but we need to do that a bit more. But what about the materials once they're forged together? What about getting that hydrocarbon out again and reused? So we have methods of getting iron out, and we have methods of getting metals out and recycling. We're really good at recycling glass. Is it a case of burning it is better? David?
I don't mind. I can. I seem to be speaking a lot. I think we have to look at the whole. I mean, we're talking here about a design failure, basically, of a product, fundamentally. And if you look at the problem, it boils down to two things. One is human negligence, and the other is a lack of waste management processes, which includes all the recycling and everything else, or insufficient. You mentioned burning it. What we've got is a problem, and we have to look at a strategic mix of solutions to resolve it. In the same way as if you think about your energy strategy for a country, for example, you live in Holland, you're going to have a lot of windmills because it's flat and there's a lot of wind. If you live in Norway, you've got a lot of mountains, you're going to have a bit of hydroelectric power. So everybody needs that mix so that it sort of fits wherever you happen to be. So incineration is one of the last resorts. But in actual fact, so is recycling. When you think about it, we shouldn't have got there in the first place, I suppose, because we should have reduced the amount. So, there's a reduce, reuse, recycle. That's an order. Please use that particular order, I think. So,
but there are ways of raising the temperature of plastics and turning them back into their constituent parts then getting the raw material and starting all over again.
Yes.
So recycling in a way that I guess that we do with glass.
Yeah,
is that the answer?
Pyrolysis?
So as I have looked into this problem, the challenge is that the topic has many facets to it, and there's many different sectors that plastics are used in. There's many different formulations of the polymers, mixtures of different polymers that make it difficult in some cases to reuse that and recycle it. But so when we approach that, there's going to have to be multiple solutions that are engaged in, and the pyrolysis is certainly will be one of the solutions. But if we want to look at it as part of the one piece of the puzzle that goes into the solution of addressing this topic.
Right. What about when it goes into our waterways? It's in our oceans. What do we do then? How do we get it out? What's the solution?
I think probably the main take-home message is not to let it get there in the first place.
But it's already there. It's already there. Can we do anything about macroplastics? Things that haven't disintegrated, that are still floating because plastic floats? Can we do anything about the microplastics that we can't even see?
Plastic only floats for a while, is one thing. Quite often that plastic is beached. So actually simple things like beach cleans do help, save them being redistributed back out to sea again. That macroplastic breaks down into the microplastics, as we spoke about. And within minutes of entering the marine environment, you'll get a biofilm on it, so you get bacteria and other things growing. So there is a thought that there's probably less than 5% of the plastic that we see on the surface. The rest is actually sunk out, even down to the deep ocean. So getting it out is going to be really, really hard.
Once it's sunk down to the deep ocean, is that okay? Does it just sit there in perpetuity?
Mm-hmm. There's something, I guess there's something to be said about these big, not quite islands floating out in the gyres that actually, for the ocean, that's almost like a desert. It's not a very productive region. It's not something which is stable. It's more like something which is swirling round and it drags the plastic in and then it swings out again. But if some of that plastic is going down to areas that aren't so productive, it's better for them perhaps in the coastal regions. But from what we understand, 80 or 90% of the plastic actually does stay near to the coast. And that's where it's really going to have a problem. And if it's on the bottom, it's just as big a problem as on the surface, because you've got so many animals living on the bottom, it can smother the bottom. And you've got lots of worms and animals which work the soil. They're called biodegradators, and so they take that plastic in and then it affects them, and then the birds eat the worms. It's better not to be there.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful about how we interpret the effects of the plastic, especially the particles. And so the thing to realize is that marine organisms are exposed to natural particles all the time. When you think about things that are in the nano-size range and the micro-size range, think about the tide changing and how much particles are being disturbed that are natural. And so these organisms are quite good at dealing with them. And so this is why, in looking at the nanoplastics, so we were working with nanoplastics radio-labeled to answer the question, are they being absorbed across biological membranes and accumulating? And we really don't find that they're being absorbed. It's minimal at best. And so we have to really interpret, where is the real problem there? And many times, and many studies are showing that there doesn't seem to be any hesitation among organisms about ingesting the plastic particles, so they readily ingest it. But effects are much more difficult to demonstrate, and the effects that are demonstrated seem to be occurring at quite elevated concentrations in the laboratory, where an organism exposed to very high concentrations, and then we can see some effects. There are perhaps some issues with particular morphologies of the plastic in a fiber shape. Perhaps that can lodge in the digestive tract in a way that prevents nutrients from passing. But we have to sort of recognize where is the real problem there. Does trying to extract plastics from the environment, is it more costly, or going out and trying to capture macroplastics from the marine environment, is the energy that we expend to do that going to be a greater problem than them actually being there? And so we have to take that into account, and we do have to be careful about interpreting the effects that are often discussed about plastics and the small particles of plastics.
And one thing we're all concerned about, of course, is it in me? Are we going to eat this? And I thought it was really interesting that you were saying it's not, our sushi isn't a problem, actually, so much as the fact that we're just breathing plastic all the time. Yeah. A lot of us have artificial carpets, or we're wearing plastic in our clothes, and it's in the fibers, and, it's in car tires, asphalt. We're just breathing all this stuff in. Yeah. Is that a problem, or is it just, nothing compared to NOx and all the other crap that we're breathing in?
So we can all be sure that we have all ingested some plastics today. All of us are sitting in our guts. There's some plastic there, plastic fiber, plastic particle. And
that doesn't mean you don't need dinner tonight or a drink. It won't fill you up that much.
So,
you can still eat.
So, and I think that, The real answer, I guess, is that we don't know absolutely the level of exposure that we have, where all of those sources of exposure are. That needs to be assessed more accurately. Effects need to be considered as well further on. We don't know what happens over long periods of time for that type of ingestion. But I think we also have to be careful about overstating those potential effects, because as a toxicologist, one of the things that we try to do is relate the toxicity of one toxicant to another. And should we be worrying about plastic, or should we be worrying about something else? And so that's we have to keep things in the right context.
So it might not be a huge health hazard for us, but your research would show that it's certainly a problem for a lot of marine animals, marine birds.
I think our concern is more about the health of those marine animals and the marine ecosystems than it is about passing it up to us as human consumption. Exactly as we've spoken about, the chances are we've breathed in far more today than you would ever get from eating a fish or anything like that. However, if we are seeing population effects, and I completely agree with Ted, we need to know where that plastic is. We know it's up at the top of the surface where the plankton are, and we know that if they are ingesting it in the natural environment, we found they've been ingesting it in the middle of the North Atlantic and up in the Arctic. And if that kills off the plankton, then we're losing that very basic food source.
Well, if it kills off the plankton, we're in absolute dreadful trouble. So
we could also be barking up the wrong tree, that if 90% of it is sinking out, it could be having much worse effect on the bottom. So I think that we do have to be cautious of what we're finding, because we're still not absolutely sure where it's coming from, where it's going, and what the problem is.
One point I would like to clarify in the context of food web transfer of these particles. So So we've often heard the term biomagnification and migration of toxicants within the food chain. So my view on these plastic particles is that they are residing within the gut of the organism. If another organism eats that organism, the biological material is digested, but the particles will pass through the gut. And so it's not getting accumulated in the liver, for example, and in the internal tissues by any evidence that I'm aware of, including the studies that we've done. And so that changes the situation. When you think about methyl mercury, for example, or a persistent organic, which genuinely does accumulate in internal tissues that we then ingest, those things can biomagnify. I don't see the same thing occurring with the plastic particles.
But the whole thing about the plastic particles is that they are adsorbing those persistent organic pollutants, as Richard Thompson's work showed a very long time ago, and it is creating, that is bioaccumulating or biomagnifying as it goes up the trophic levels. I think, and I agree, we don't want to freaking out the world, but I can tell you one thing without doing any scientific study or any peer-reviewed papers at all, is that inhaling, ingesting, and doing all these other things with microplastics and nanoparticles isn't going to be beneficial. That's a fact.
Are there particular types of plastic that are worse than others for the environment or for the health that we can avoid, or that we should we be using a different type of plastic?
I think that's where we still need to do more research. Yeah, and that was what I was saying. We could really help some of the mitigation. We could help the material scientists by knowing a little bit more about that. We're only just beginning to realize that certain shapes are worse than others. So there's still work to do, I think.
From what I've seen on the toxicology side, I don't see any issues that worry me about the different polymers of plastic in terms of their toxicology. The shape is an issue that is a concern.
Does some have hormonal effects, or
So we have to be careful also about the bioavailability of substances. So we've done a lot of studies on this topic, and so certainly plastics, they present a hydrophobic environment, which means substances that don't like water will stick to them. They can get absorbed within the plastic. But realize that does not mean that they're bioavailable. And so much of the work that we've done has shown that actually the bioavailability is reduced. So if you look at the evidence, if there's plastic in the environment, one could argue that toxic substances that are present in the environment are sticking to the plastic and are less bioavailable to the organisms if we look at the evidence. Okay, so we have to be careful about that. The other thing we have to realize is that the concentration of the toxicants that are on the plastics, we can detect them at exceedingly low concentrations. But their presence doesn't mean that they're having a biological effect. And so we have to be careful about that. And whether that, just because a particular substance that is known to have endocrine disrupting capability, just because it's found associated with a plastic after extraction doesn't mean that it's actually having that effect in the organism. And the reason I emphasize this point is because it is important that we direct the energy that we employ to addressing this problem to the right issues. And that one, to me, is not as big of an issue. Now, one very nice study that was done looked at plastic seabirds that had ingested plastics, and they found that seabirds that had ingested plastic compared to ones that had ingested less plastic had lower concentrations of persistent organic substances. So what the authors of that study concluded was that actually the plastics were serving as a way for the substances to depurate from the organism and be extracted. I'm not saying which one is right or wrong, but when we have the conversation, we need to include that piece of evidence within the narrative.
Thinking about which plastics we might want to take forward and which might be better or worse, there's current material science research looking at alternative recycling routes. So traditionally when we recycle plastics, we heat them up and we melt them down and we reform them into a different shape. But there's other methods too, and one of those methods is using biology to try and recycle plastics and break them down. So it's slightly different from biodegrading. What we're actually doing is looking for plastics in the environment and seeing that some sort of microorganisms have evolved to consume those plastics. And so what material scientists are interested in is, can we work out what are the enzymes, what are those chemicals that they're using to do that, and can we harness those, recreate those in the lab, and have some kind of sort of biodigesters to make a chemical recycling process rather than a thermal recycling process. And that might open up new routes to recycling plastics that currently aren't recyclable using the current routes. And if we can do that, then we can use those.
Yeah, I've seen quite a lot of papers coming out recently with enzymes and microorganisms that can digest plastics. How close is this to reality? How much is it in a tiny little test tube and not going to save us?
Really good question. I suppose that's now an issue of getting technology out of a lab and into actualization. Often that can take several decades, depending on the scale of it.
Can any of them be scaled up? Are we talking about very, very niche conditions where it will only work and it needs so much heat input and so much pressure or so many nutrients that actually it just becomes very energy expensive or too much of a payoff in some other way?
That's definitely a risk to it. I'm not familiar with the papers, the ins and outs of all the papers, sure. But you can imagine that there would be scale-up problems with lots of different technologies like that. Yeah.
So you were talking about mussels. That was really exciting.
Can I just take a step back to ask Anna a question, actually? I know one of the problems with recycling can be that when we put stuff into the recycling bins, they're not properly cleaned and it can have a lot of food waste and organic material on it. Do you know if this biological process might be able to better accommodate waste on the plastic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For plastics, the food waste problem isn't such an issue with the heating up process, because generally when you heat materials up, a lot of those food waste products will sort of effectively evaporate, or they're not a problem with the chemistry of it. For materials like paper, oils are a problem because you don't heat paper up to recycle it. It's a dissolution process, so it's actually just water, and water and oil don't mix, and so that can get really gloopy and horrid. With the biological processes, I'm no biologist, but I would imagine that any kind of contaminants might change the biology in that system. So that's a really good point that we might need to consider how we recycle and where it comes from. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I just wanted to ask you, David, you've watched this issue change over the years. Have you personally seen the issue of plastics in the oceans becoming greater? Have you personally seen more plastic where you've gone? I remember being in India and just suddenly having this kind of wake-up moment where I just saw stacks and stacks of plastic, whereas 10 years ago I just hadn't seen anything because people were still using biodegradable products. And the sort of cheap influx of because they don't have the infrastructure there to deal with it. I wonder, have you noticed this?
I have. I mean, as an underwater photographer, underwater camera, and I've written about this. And I used to take really nice pictures of things, and now people think I'm quite sad. My holiday snaps are really quite depressing, quite frankly. But yeah, I mean, you're looking at, in actual fact, 2016 figures with 335 million tons, which is the same weight as the population of the planet, which was made...
Isn't that the most extraordinary thing?
Yeah, but that doesn't include as well, when you look at the figures that they give you in the little small print, they say this doesn't include PET fibers, so all your clothes, all your carpets, everything else is not included in that figure of 335 million tons. We're talking about $1 billion industry. There is a very interesting thing that I have noticed recently, and I was filming in Indonesia in June this year. And everybody always talks about, in terms of wildlife and marine animals, they talk about ingestion, they talk about entanglement, and invasive species less, because obviously with so much plastic, invasive species increase. But there's one that I really noticed, and I filmed it, and it's habitat change. And it's actually presenting us with a slight ethical dilemma, which is an interesting one. And I went to pick up a bottle when I was doing this, and I thought, oh, it's rubbish, I'll go and pick it up. And actually, I looked at it, and there was a piece of coral on there, and I thought, that's about 6 years' worth of coral. Damn it, I can't do anything with that. And then I saw another little, and actually it looked like a piece of medical equipment, because there was a sort of graticule on the side that said 6 mil. But a fish that would normally be in a natural habitat had made it a home, and I went to pick it up, and I thought, no. And we're as well as we're now So, and I was talking to some Indonesian students while I was there, and I said, here's the ethical dilemma. Do I pick that up and allow that animal now to have to try and find somewhere to live quickly before it's predated? Or do I actually leave it because it's now changed the habitat? And there was it's a kind of an ethical one there as well.
It's really
an
interesting
one.
as well, because a lot of these floating plastic sort of gyres where they've kind of come together, they're in places where there aren't naturally floating materials. So near coasts, you might get driftwood and other debris, natural debris that crabs and mussels and other life can sit on. But now these islands are becoming little new ecosystems.
Well, the fish aggregation devices. So
they can seek shelter. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they are becoming little ecosystems on their own. So we are creating with our waste, new types of new ecosystems, which is really interesting. I'm going to open this up to our incredible audience, who I'm sure have got loads of really great questions, but this is apparently a debate. I didn't realize that. So before I do that, I'm just going to ask all of you, should we get rid of plastics?
Oh, no, absolutely not. Plastics have a great contribution to make to us. We need to use them properly and dispose of them properly and work towards having a circular economy for plastics.
Anna, I'm thinking you're probably going to say yes?
Yeah, I think plastics have done more to save the environment than any other material if you consider the weight saving that we've been transporting goods and planes and all the rest of it. The fuel savings that plastic has given us has probably saved our global warming problem.
I don't think we should get rid of plastic, but I think we need to be more sensible in how we use it and how we deal with it when we finish with it.
David?
No, we shouldn't. I like living in the 21st century. Keep the medieval ages in the films, and that'll do fine. But we just need to manage it. This is a process problem and a design problem.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to open it up to questions. Where is my first question? Yeah. Oh, sorry, I thought you had someone in mind. I was waiting for that.
Oh, yes,
Oh, yes,
she does have.
Okay, I can't see. Where are the mics?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes.
She's there.
Oh, you have given it someone.
Yes.
Sorry, it's hard to see you. Hello. Please tell us your question. And can I just say that if we can keep the questions very short and precise, have a little bit of thought for other people who also might want to ask questions. So no really long rambling kind of statements, if possible.
Do you think that having shadow prices on plastics in a sort of monetary term so that people have a comprehensible understanding of the environmental impact of that product will stop the irresponsible consumption of plastics rather than fueling the war on plastics themselves?
And is that to a specific person or just a general question?
No, just in general.
Who would like to answer that?
I didn't quite get it.
Okay, do you think having shadow prices on plastic products with a sort of monetary...
Like the 5p bag charge, stuff like that, yeah.
Like with the environmental impact in a term that people can't understand, will stop people's irresponsible consumption of plastics and take the attention away from the plastics themselves and rather the individual effects of people's actions.
Can I just check, can everybody hear this or do I need to repeat the question? Everybody heard it, brilliant. So who would like to answer that question?
I can do that.
David?
I think the problem is, if you look at what we call single-use plastic, and it could be argued actually that anything that's not recycled is single-use if you want, but it is that the value perception of that product is zero. That is the biggest thing, and that's, if we wanted to change anything, certainly in the developing world, it's putting in systems and processes that can change that whole perception that plastic is free. All the single-use plastic you've ever paid for, you go, I haven't paid for that, that's why you throw it in the bin. And if you look at something like a bottle of water, for example, the cost of a bottle of water is about 500 times more than it would be if you got the same amount of water from a tap. So if you were economically minded or sort of being a little bit frugal that month, the best thing you could do is to throw the water away and keep the bottle because it's worth more money. And that is the ridiculous stupidity of what we've got with this product. We throw bottles away. Bottle PET, for example, which is what your water bottle is, that's worth about £250 on the open market, just baled as a recycled product. And yet we chuck it away. It's bonkers. There's a reason that you don't see them on the floor in Germany, by the way, and that's because every single one's worth 25 cents and has been since they introduced the law in 1991. Time to catch up, isn't it?
Brilliant, brilliant. Okay. Yeah, so there's a woman there and a man there. Can you? Okay.
You mentioned that Waitrose funded one of the studies. Yeah. What other big companies have taken to this initiative and saving the oceans?
That's a good point. None that I can think of off the top of my head. Anyone else?
So, I mean, should the big companies that are producing these plastics become more involved in scientific research in terms of funding it?
Yes, they should. This is a design problem. This is extended producer responsibility is crucial if we're going to resolve this. The reason that the German model, which was begun which I just mentioned, started in 1991, is paid for. So all of the recycling is paid for by the people who produce it. That's why they've got a very efficient system. It's paid for by the people who make the plastics, who sell the plastics, and they all pay, depending on how much turnover they do, how much plastic they use, they put money in. It's called the green dot system.
We should also say that culturally and in terms of social norms, German people are much better at recycling. Individuals are much better at recycling. They've sort of grown up with it. It's almost taboo to throw something away in the way that we do and not put them in specific boxes. And we're really very, very far behind in this country. And that's something we need to change as well.
There are historical and sort of reasons for that. And one of them, obviously, the country was decimated during the war, and then they had this industrial sort of revolution kind of thing happened, and they didn't want to see it happen again. And also, they have a government system that meant that they have coalition governments, and so there's a massive growth of the Green Party. Very, very different, but it's still a great model, and it's something that we could aspire to without any shadow of a doubt.
Great. And there's a gentleman here with a question.
There's one for David. I think about 20 years ago, when we first started looking at this problem, people were looking at the chain stoppers in particularly PVC, and now they were phthalates, and people did some surveys of the accumulation of phthalates in the fat of mammals throughout the planet. There wasn't a mammal that they analysed that didn't have phthalates in its fat, and the thought was then that it might have been toxic, precautionary principle, it shouldn't be there. But it was a monitor of the increasing level of plastics in mammals' body fat. And I'm wondering whether this research has gone on and whether that's a general thing. It doesn't matter whether it's airborne or waterborne. Are the phthalates accumulating in mammals' fat all over the globe, and is it still going on?
Yeah, this is something maybe Ted could answer as well.
Yeah.
I mean, so the question that you touch on a very important topic, which is the additives within plastics that are something that give us the properties of some of the polymers that we desire, their flexibility and their other things. And so those substances can have important toxicological properties, and the phthalates that you mentioned are among those.
So it's not the hydrocarbon chain itself. It's the chemicals that are added to that to give it a different property that we want.
So an example of that, we were investigating effects of PVC, polyvinyl chloride, and we found that some of the genes that we investigate were turned on from metal exposure. We're like, how is this happening with PVC? Come to find out that the PVC that we were using had a lead additive to it. And so in this, we analyzed the plastic itself and resolved, it's actually the lead that's driving that. So we do need to be conscious of the substances that are used within that. I understand that lead is no longer used in PVC, so we can be confident about that. But it is the topic of substances like phthalates and like other things that have been added to it is an important part of the question.
Yeah, and when material scientists are designing the plastics, obviously it's not just the actual plastic. There is nothing that's just a pure plastic. And so, are there choices that we can make, and are material scientists actually looking at the longevity and the bioavailability of some of these additives and trying to eliminate them or trying to choose more wisely?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that we can change in our field is actually that we don't currently have a precedent on when we create new materials or when we create new uses for materials. There's no precedent set currently for a discussion when you write up that paper or when you give that talk to discuss the end of life of that material. It's just, I've never, ever, ever seen it, ever. And I've read some papers on material science. And that's because often when we create new materials, our aim is to create something that works better than something else. It's very rarely to create something that is more environmentally friendly than something else. And I think one thing we can learn from tonight is that we really actually need that. And so hopefully we'll see that more.
We need a paradigm shift in the way we think
Absolutely.
about everything we do. We need to think about the environmental repercussions, whether it's the energy put in or whether it's how much carbon it involves and emits. And yeah, can I take another question? There's a woman here. And is there anybody up there? I'm going to take 3 more questions at once.
Yep, we have a question up in the gallery as well.
At the gallery? I can't see up there.
Over here, in the middle.
Yeah,
Yep.
You've got, so there's somebody at the upstairs. We'll take one from here first, one from up there, and we'll take one more question. There's somebody waving at the back. Okay, so I'm going to go here, gallery, and then there. 3 questions.
As individuals, what do you think, each of you think, is the kind of one thing we could take away and do to help change and improve this situation?
Right, did everybody hear that? Mm-hmm. Great. Gallery?
I was just wondering who you think the best kind of groups to incentivize are in terms of dealing with this problem. So is it the primary producers, is it the distributors or retailers, or is it the public? And maybe some best methods to go about it other than the plastic bottle charge.
Thank you. And the last question.
Hi. In a similar vein to the question over there, I think it strikes me that because we're not living in Germany, and probably none of us are going to move to Germany anytime soon, that the only way to influence the economic model over here is by directly purchasing from certain companies who are a bit more favourable in thinking about these things, as opposed to those who are less positive and favourable thinking about these sort of issues. So if each of you could recommend maybe particular companies who you know are more mindful of these sort of issues, so it gives us as consumers more of a choice.
Brilliant, thank you. So, first question: what can we as individuals do? Let's just list one thing.
I swapped plastic milk bottles for glass milk bottles from a local farm, and that's seriously reducing the amount of single-use plastic I use.
Brilliant.
Say no to biodegradable plastics.
Brilliant. One for later to catch up.
I would say be critical of the information you receive. Think about it from multiple sides, and try to look for what is the evidence that's supporting particular points.
Well, your question is, what can we do? And my answer is, everything that we have, the plastic industry is all about consumers. You are the consumers, and you have a choice. You have free will. So think about your choices, is what I would say. And if you have an option, then make that option.
Brilliant. Okay. And the second question.
Which I can't remember. I'm getting old.
I'm really sorry. Can you please remind me? Yes. Yeah. Whose fault is this big mess? Come on now. Is it us? Is it the producers? Is it the government? Who's to blame for this big mess we're in?
So I think every sector has a role in the solution to this. So each of those, and we're not going to solve it by targeting any one group. It has to address all of them.
Yeah. Anybody else want to add to that? Maybe it's the damn dolphins, right? Because they're eating the plastic.
Kill all the dolphins. No, I don't. There is a cultural change that needs to happen. without doubt. You know, the fact that it's okay now to buy a £20 tent and go to a festival and leave it is a disgrace, quite frankly. But ultimately, I do believe that it's the producers. You know, they produce things that we actually never asked for. And you look at it, they do things, and there's one reason that they produce those things: profit. That's it. And you know, they need to be held account. I have had conversations with the British Plastics Federation and Plastics Europe. For whatever reason, they're really reluctant to talk to me.
Strange.
Don't know.
Is it something you said?
Must be. But you know, but when I have to give false excuses to go there. But you know, their argument is that they don't put the stuff into the ocean. They don't throw it into the environment, so therefore it's not their fault. Well, that's just biggest cop out that I've ever heard. They need to take responsibility. They need, if necessary, they need to be forced to take responsibility.
Yeah.
It's a design issue.
And our final.
Excuse me, can I provide a debate on that?
Yeah.
I spent 18 years working for McDonald's.
Is it your fault?
It's, when we developed the salads, we developed it in plastic packaging. I've left the company now 9 years ago. If you go into a McDonald's now, you get a salad in a cardboard box. They moved away from plastic. The reason that they do that is because they believe that the consumer wants that. Okay? It is absolutely all within our power, with the choices that we make, that you influence and incentivize these companies to change.
Brilliant. So this actually taps in exactly to our last question, which is which are the companies that are doing something about it? And I'm not sure if we're going to say McDonald's is the answer, but they are changing. They're changing because of consumer pressure, and of course we are the ones paying for their bills, so we can change it. Does anybody want to highlight a company or somebody who they think is doing something that we should champion?
I just think that we have a decision to make. We also have to be given that choice to make the decision. We've spoken a lot about plastic packaging in supermarkets. We also need to think about clothing, as you said about tents, and that fast fashion where you buy something cheap, you wash it a lot, and then it gets thrown away because it hasn't lasted is a real problem. And I think clothing companies, dare I say, like Patagonia, that are really thinking about what they're using, how they're making their garments, how long they last, and actually they're taking them back and recycling as well. So it is just stopping and having a think. There are companies out there which are looking at this and making it better, and there are others that are just trying to sell more and more, quicker and quicker to make a big profit.
Exactly. Anybody else got?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier about modular design and this idea that rather than throwing the whole phone away, you could just get a new battery. The company's called Fairphone, and the reviews on their phones have been quite negative, but they've got the right idea, which is the main thing, which is
they don't work.
Not massively selling them.
I haven't got one, but the point is that when they upgrade the camera, you just slot the new camera in. When the battery breaks, you get a new battery. And that type, maybe not whatever, make your own choices, but that type of approach of modular design, if we can be encouraging more and more companies like that, and with our money and with our purchases, then that would be a really significant change.
There are also a lot of community groups coming together to repair things, repairing workshops. Also, there are online plenty of hacking engineers who will show you how to repair your iPhone, even though they don't want you to repair it, and who will show you how to repair your toaster or whatever is broken. So there are ways of getting around this, and there is a kind of guerrilla movement towards it. But of course, we all need to do more. I don't think we've completely solved the problem of plastics in the oceans. A little bit disappointed, but I think you can all agree we've had a really stimulating discussion here, and I just want to thank you for being here, and of course to thank our fantastic panel who've been great. So it's David Jones, Penny Lindeku, Anna Pushaisky, and Ted Henry. And thanks very much for coming.